My name is Mark Fenton. I'm from the greater Boston area. I'm an engineer by training. As you learned, I was a race walker by avocation. I used to be a competitive race walker, which we learned you were as well. We'll talk about that in a second. What we're doing is demonstrating a process we call a walk audit. That's where we go out and audit or assess the environment on foot. So we call it a walk audit. We do bicycle audits too, where sometimes we ride bicycles. Sometimes we use the transit system. But we try to be out there in an active way, not just in a car, on doing these kinds of things, is that you go scout the area ahead of time. You have to know where you're going to take the group. So if you were going to lead a walk audit, I would say be prepared to go look at the area ahead of time, figure out your walk, figure out how long it is going to take so that you don't plan for 1 hour and it takes you 2 hours, that it's reasonable. And you also have what I call the teachable moments. So on this little summary sheet, I actually talk about how I plan and organize walk audits. So you all have this. I just want to make sure you all got a copy, and if not, we can make more. But I talk about finding sort of those opportunities where we'll stop and talk about what is good and what is bad. So I'm going to demonstrate how we do that. Yes, we want the individual engaged, but it's not enough. We need the community designed in a way so they can make healthy habits. And then the second thing you ask, well, can we actually build places where their behavior will be better? If we build it, will they come? This is an important question because I can assert I can build a healthier community, but you should say to me, is there evidence you can actually create it? I'm going to convince you yes, by the way. Yes is the answer to that. And then you should say, well, if it's such a good idea, the United States, America, is a capitalist society. So why doesn't the free market take us there? Why doesn't the marketplace tell us this is how we design our communities? I'm going to tell you that it is. The marketplace is telling us this is the design that is preferred by the market. How do we actually design these places? What's your prescription? Here's my point. I want you all equipped with the answers to these 4 questions so that when you go to convey this message to others and you get what I expect to be the pushback, right? This is a resistance you're going to get. It's a matter of personal responsibility. You can't really build such places. If it's such a good idea, why doesn't the market take us there? How do we actually do it? But then I asked 2 more questions, and I want you guys to answer these right now. Raise your hands. How many of you think the majority of kids today, first of all, how many of you would have called yourself a free-range kid? Would you say yes, free-range kid? You were out playing, do your thing. Now, how many of you believe most kids today are free-range kids? Not so much, right? We don't have free-range kids. Here's the last question. How many think it's good for their health that they're not free-range kids? Is it a good thing we don't have free-range kids anymore? So think about what we've said as recently as 2 decades, 3, 4 decades ago, in my case, 40 years ago. 2 generations, though, we had a lot of free-range kids. We don't have them anymore, and we all agree it's not good for them. Which begs the question, what are we going to do about it? Unfortunately, of course, when we ask parents, why don't you let your kids be free-range like Mark Fenton, walk to school every day from 4th grade on, take off on a Saturday morning on his bicycle? When we ask parents, what do they say? No. Why can't they do it? Why can't they let their kids be free-range like we were? It's not safe. There are scary men with thick mustaches hiding behind every tree. The mustache men are out there. Now, to be very clear, I'm a parent of a 16-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old son. I am very careful about where they are and when. I know there are places that it is dangerous for kids to be. By the same token, my wife and I have worked very hard to let them be free-range kids. And I serve on my local planning board and she on our financial advisory board in our community so that we make investments as a community to build places that will be for free-range kids. In other words, I feel my job is to try to rebuild a world so that my kids can live as free-range as I did. Over the last 30 or 40 years, as an example, the percentage of kids walking and bicycling to school, the green bars here, have gone from over 40% to only about 15%. The percentage of kids being driven to school by car went from 15% to almost 50%. Kids being dropped off and picked up. It's just heartbreaking to think many of those kids are coming from a distance of 1 mile or less, right? 2 kilometers or less, a walking distance, but mom and dad are so petrified. As opposed to thinking the solution might be, maybe we could get a group of kids from the neighborhood and one adult could walk with them, create what we call a walking school bus, right? And I do Monday, maybe you do Tuesday, and you do Wednesday, and you do Thursday. My wife organized one of those, I'm proud to say, in our neighborhood. Yeah, she did a great job. It was very successful. A walking bus. And here's the interesting thing that came from the walking bus. Eventually, the parents became comfortable letting the kids walk. They realized, well, the streets aren't that dangerous. The other interesting thing that happened was childhood obesity rates tripled. And it's the same exact time. Over the time in which we got in the habit of putting our kids in the car for every trip, this is what we've done to their health. Indeed, we talk about a national obesity epidemic, which is the wrong thing to think about, I believe. I believe we should be talking about a chronic disease apocalypse, nothing less than an apocalypse. And the chronic diseases are things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, right? That whole metabolic syndrome that's associated with a sedentary lifestyle and poor nutrition. Our genetics have not changed in 40 years. You know, your genes don't change that fast. What changed is our lifestyle. And I believe these are the two epidemics we should be talking about, and they are in fact two of the three risk factors that fill our hospital beds and that burden our healthcare system in the foreseeable future if we don't do something about them. So it's physical inactivity, poor nutrition, and tobacco use. How do we reduce these three risk factors in the population and recognize the case that I'm going to make today that simply telling people to exercise or eat well or stop smoking is not enough? That we need to take a systems-based approach.
Nice gag.
This is me competing in the 91 national championships. That's Washington, D.C. That's the Lincoln Memorial. We're on a 2-kilometer loop out there in front of the memorial in Washington, the national 20-kilometer championships. I was a 50K race walker. But I also lived and worked at the U.S. Olympic Training Center. I worked at Reebok's Human Performance Lab. So I'm an exercise science nerd, actually. Engineering is my background, studied biomechanics. I tell you that because I spent a lot of time sort of in that field. By the way, many people will ask why race walking, so I'm going to show you one more picture to explain why I chose to be a race walker. Of course, it was the huge crowds that showed up at our competition. And that's not a doctored photo. That's me competing in the 1984 Olympic trials 50-kilometer race walk. Now, 50 kilometers is 31 miles. 30, 23, 65. 30 is the minutes per day we're told we should be physically active for adults. We know kids should get a minimum of 1 hour a day. These are minimum recommendations. Sadly, 20 is a generous estimate of the percentage who actually get the 30 minutes per day. At most, it's 20% of Americans. I believe it's actually much lower. I'll speak to that in a moment. 365, well, sadly, it's not days of the year. If you add 3 zeros, we estimate the number of premature deaths annually in the United States at 365,000 premature deaths every year. So those guidelines that I just alluded to are really described in terms of weekly dose, 150 minutes a week for adults, 300 minutes a week for kids, but divide by 5 and you have about 30 minutes a day. So if you could average 30 minutes most days of the week, you would live a longer, healthier life. You'd be at reduced risk for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, clinical depression, a growing list of cancers. We know physically active people are at lower risk for cancer than sedentary people. Last point on the public health. This will be sort of the end of the geeky public health stuff. Why is it so hard to change? I think it's the stickiness problem. And I think that's reflected by an elegantly simple study done by a guy named John Jakisik, although there are others like this, that tried to get people to walk about 40 minutes a day. And he had 3 groups in his study. One group was told, walk your 40 minutes all at once. One group was told you can break it into 4 10-minute walks, if that's easier. Third group, not only did they break it into 4 10-minute walks, they put a treadmill in their house. So that's what the T stands for, short bouts with treadmill. And then over 6 months, this is an 18-month period here that they followed the people. Over the first 6 months, they did everything that we like to do in our exercise program. So they called them on the phone and sent them email reminders. They sent up walking groups. They taught them how to warm up before and how to stretch afterwards and how to select good walking shoes so they didn't get injured. They gave them an exercise diary, and if you filled it out and turned it in at regular intervals, you got prizes like t-shirts and water bottles. And over the short term, it works, right? Over 6 months, they got the people in the study. These are people who signed up for the study to increase, on average, their exercise minutes per week. But that's not the interesting question, right? From a public health standpoint, what I want to know is, a year later, have you continued to increase your exercise, or have you maintained it, or has it dropped off? So let me be clear. Even moderate daily walking, 30 to 40 minutes, they were losing weight and getting more fit. What we're recognizing is simply telling people to exercise and educating and informing and encouraging is not enough. We've probably got to think about ways that they can build routine daily activity into their lives. What's the nutritional correlate of that? Getting somebody on a diet, we know what happens to diets. People are counting the days till they hit their goal and they can get off the diet because this diet is restrictive and it's not sustainable. We need to help people find ways that the quality and healthy food choices are accessible, affordable, and they become part of their normal consumption pattern. And what most would call this is a socio-ecological approach. It says we can't just focus on the individual and their motivation and their skills, but that we have to have other sort of factors that drive behavior change. that all of these influences, from family and friends at the interpersonal level to the institutions like your healthcare or your local community organization or your school or your employer, to the community by its very design and facilities, to public policy, all of these things have to drive you in that direction. By the way, I want to just point out that smoking is not the only success example. We have that example, but I would argue seatbelts and child safety restraints were a socio-ecological change. We forget that one of the great successes of modern public health is clean water. We take for granted that we don't have cholera outbreaks, even in massive urbanized areas like New York and LA. Think about the horrible tragedy still going on in Haiti right now, a live cholera epidemic, largely because of the lack of sanitation systems. They know vaccination is not going to solve this problem. What they need to do is build, modern sanitation systems so that they have clean water available. For many people, this is somewhat intuitive on the nutrition side. They say, I get it. I understand why we want to take candy machines and soda out of schools and instead have healthy choices available. I understand why my neighborhood should have fewer fast food joints, what are often called food swamps, right? Or food deserts where there are just no food choices at all, and have more healthy choices like a farmer's market and things like that. We recognize this will serve that 5% of the population that are conscious exercise. The other exercises, the other 85 to 95%, we've got to make the real world be where they're physically active. Okay? Questions on this first premise, which is it's not just a matter of personal responsibility. There are environmental influences, and if you want to be successful, even if you're doing good programming, we need a stickier world to sustain the success of those programs. Question number 2. Can we build places that are stickier, basically? So you've asserted, Mark, we need to worry about stickiness. We somehow have got to get the environment to encourage routine physical activity. Does it exist? And the short answer is yes. 4 things actually seem to characterize such environments. And they are a greater variety of different kinds of land uses in proximity. So, different kinds of stuff is close together. There are good facilities connecting them, trails, sidewalks, bicycle lanes, a good transit network. They would talk about a mix of land uses, a network of facilities, functional site design, universal safety and access. That's language that would be utterly familiar. If you picked up a planning magazine or a journal, you would see entire articles that talk about this stuff. And indeed, this is the evidence base that I use to make this argument to you. So when we talk about land uses, all photos from Queens, by the way, everything I'm illustrating now I can use from here. Because you've got compact neighborhoods with everything from single-family homes to row houses to multi-story housing, often with housing above retail on the first floor, neighborhood schools, neighborhood shopping, parks that act as collected green space. So rather than every home having a suburban-style yard, we go to collected shared open space rather than each home having open space. Next is the network of facilities. We need the sidewalks, the bicycle lanes. They need to be cleared in the winter and kept in good repair. The transit network. We know transit is an important part of the physical activity network because regular transit riders get more daily physical activity, even when they control for conscious exercisers. 3, the destination. When I get to it, does it reward me or punish me for showing up without a car? Now, this is interesting because this is just a little corner store gas station, but I walked by a Staples, 6-8 blocks from here, that looked like it could be out in suburban America. Parking lot out in front, building set back. It astonished me to see that in Queens, right? That suburban style design. Versus building up at the street, awnings, things like trees and benches and bike racks. But I would argue that these are the things that we know increase the likelihood of people walking or bicycling to a destination. So the beauty of the urban grid is that's the standard design. Here's a Target in downtown Minneapolis. It's arguably their main store because they're based in Minneapolis. That's right on the Nicollet Mall. And I note that only because I'd want to say to Target, and I do any chance I get, I show them the picture and I say, why do you build those kinds of Targets out on the edge of town with big parking lots around them set back? Why don't we use this as the model going forward? That has to be what we say because that's the walk bike friendly one. Last but not least, it's got to be safe and accessible, and there's a very broad toolkit that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes of ways to design streets that work for pedestrians, bicyclists, transit, and motor vehicles. Things like curb extension. So this curb is bumped out here, allowing this pedestrian to walk out, see the oncoming traffic. It shortens his crossing distance. It slows turning vehicles. So there are a bunch of reasons that makes it safer for the pedestrian, but also, frankly, better for the car, too, because I can see the pedestrian out there showing his intent to cross, right? If he's standing back here at the corner, I'm not sure. Is he going, isn't he? Roundabouts, mid-block crossings, islands like this in the road that allow pedestrians to cross safely. These are all examples of the tools in the toolkit that make it safer for bicycle and pedestrian travel that engineers have available. But here's the important point. If all we do is ask them to move more cars faster, which we've done for the last 30, 40 years, you end up with Queens Boulevard, right? Add lanes, make the road straighter, make it faster, make it wider. If we say build a road where pedestrians and bicyclists can coexist, you end up with very different designs. And you have examples of that in New York as well, right? We see a lot of that in Manhattan, and some of it's starting to happen over here. Last point, I've talked all around physical activity. I admitted that that was going to be the focus, but let me say this. The moment we start to get to things like design regulations and zoning ordinances is an opportunity to talk about not just physical activity, but nutrition as well. So the kinds of things we're seeing communities do is when they look at their zoning ordinance or their planning documents, say, where are we going to put the community gardens? We saw a lot of individual lots where just the homeowners are doing gardening, you know, small container gardening and grape arbors and things like that. But your zoning can make it a lot easier if you allow for backyard beekeeping, chickens, composting. Those are things that can be part of the ordinance and allowed or, not, or discouraged. So I offer all of that. Where are you going to locate your farmers market? Are there neighborhood green grocers? And there are parts of the country where they're very directly addressing how much more fast food they want. So in Los Angeles, as part of an initiative very much like this, they've put in place a moratorium on the development of any more fast food. You can't get a permit to build another McDonald's there because they said, we have plenty of them. And by the way, when we studied where their highest density was, we noted that the highest density of fast food restaurants correlated to our lowest income neighborhoods. So this is my summary, and the real reason I put this slide up is sort of, I think you can say, yes, if we build it, they will come, and these are the 4 or 5 things you really want to do to build healthier environments. This is a great website, activelivingresearch.org. If you're a nerd and you're saying, where do I find the articles, Mark, that support this argument? Where can I find this stuff? This is not a bad place to start. San Diego, University of San Diego, right? UC San Diego, Jim Salas's group, Active Living Research. That leads us to this question. If it's such a good idea, this is the question that I get. I'll have an elected board, a city council sitting here, or economic development officer, or a planning commission. If it's such a good idea, why isn't the marketplace taking us there? Why isn't, we're a free market society, why doesn't capitalism say this would be the natural outcome? My answer is that that's exactly what is happening. That indeed the marketplace is telling us this is exactly what people want. I will start by reminding you about the website called WalkScore. Who knows what WalkScore is? Have you heard about this? Oh, write this down. This is a great one. Write down walkscore.com. It's all one word right here at the bottom, walkscore.com. You can put any address in the United States of America, punch it in there, and it will give you a score. From 0 to 100. 100 is if it's very walkable, 0 if it's not at all. This publication is called On Common Ground. It asked the question in 2010, what's the next generation of home buyers looking for? What are the mega trends for the decade? And what they said is, people want to live back in town. They want public transportation. They want to be able to walk to a trail, to a nearby park. They want to be able to walk their kids to school and walk to a coffee shop. Look at the picture on the front, you guys. It's a girl on a bike with a baguette and sunflowers in the basket. For God's sakes, it looks like the Netherlands. This is a publication not of the Sierra Club. It's the National Association of Realtors, who are business people, who say, our job is to sell homes. So our job is to survey the marketplace every year annually and look for trends. What are home buyers asking for? This is the stuff they're asking for now. Let's talk about these economics. This publication from the New York City Department of Transportation actually looked at retail activity on streets that have had some of the sort of infamous street improvements, that were so controversial at the time, taking away lanes, making it safer for bicyclists and pedestrians, adding safe crossings and so on. What they measured were statistically significant higher retail revenue and or tax revenue from those streets that have had the improvements compared to comparable streets that didn't have the improvements, okay? So they're telling us the economic activity goes up as we make it safer for people to walk from store to store and across the street and things like that. This publication is the National Association of Home Builders, who are now, their title of this special issue was Walkability, Why We Care and Why You Should Too. The economics are telling us people actually are desiring this stuff. There's a market for it. In fact, the Urban Land Institute and some other institutions would tell you we have an oversupply of suburban style, single lot housing, and we have an undersupply of the very places we're talking about, walkable, bike-friendly, transit-friendly settings, over the next decade, the market's going to have to shift and give people these options. So how do we get there? I'm going to offer, I wrote this article for the journal Childhood Obesity a few years ago, a couple years ago now. They said, write an article, do a review article on what you think are the promising strategies to fight childhood obesity in the coming decades. And they thought I was probably going to talk about PE programs and walking and, you know, sort of exercise classes and all that stuff, parks and recreation programs. I said, you're not going to get that from me, so you tell me if you want this article. But what you're going to get is, I think we got to change the fabric of our cities to build them for free-range kids again. So I think we have to look at our land use planning and our zoning ordinances. We have to impart complete streets guidelines, build trail networks for transportation, not just recreation, but trails that get from neighborhoods to schools, from senior housing to shopping. That we have to build bicycle and transit infrastructure and do what's called transportation demand management. That's an entire discipline. The acronym is TDM, Transportation Demand Management. There are people who study the science of this, more economists and transportation planners than public health people, but it should be one of the big tools in our toolkit. One of the problems is many of those things are indeed happening, and maybe you're getting a flavor of this here in New York City, where there are vocal advocates, where there are people to speak up for themselves. So a wealthy neighborhood that says we want a nice bike trail along the Hudson River, so you end up with that beautiful path going all up and down the river, right? And you know, sort of the upper middle class and upper class folks that can live there use it for recreation and for transportation now, because they're able to advocate and they have political pull. They can show up at City Hall. So we're finding that successful communities have to reach out and, for example, make multilingual materials. So we were talking about this. We're going to do walkability checklists or the how to do a walk audit. Maybe this needs to be translated into a few appropriate languages as an example, just an example. And reach out to other partners, churches, maybe social and health services. Here we stand at Edikar, right, as a great example of that. Tackle the notion of gentrification right up front. So here's what happens. People see this, and then their first reaction is, oh my gosh, if this becomes a desirable enough neighborhood with all these bike paths and everything, then wealthier folks are going to move in, housing values will go up, the very people who live here are going to get pushed out. So, but the problem with that is I think it's flawed at the premise, because I want this to be an economically robust neighborhood. I just don't want the push-out part to happen. So what it means is, as things redevelop, we've got to make sure we maintain affordable components. So there are tools in the toolkit. Make sure that there's still a range in the housing stock. Everything can't go up to 3,500 square foot penthouses on the top of tall buildings, right? We got to make sure that there are still modest sized units. The other thing I want to point out is, remember the pyramid. The base of the pyramid is policy change. So a classic example of this being, I think, the centerpiece of the work, okay? Because in the end, if you don't get to policy, you're still just encouraging, and it's still going to have the stickiness curve problem. So in this Safe Routes to School program in Columbia, Missouri, here's a walking bus. This is a local university student. She's a college student earning public service hours, community service hours, by walking groups of kids to school every day. Great. There were parents that weren't letting the kids walk because the traffic in front of the school was so bad. They said, even though you're walking them, I'm worried about the last 300 yards because the traffic at the school is so bad. So what does that parent do instead? They drive, thereby inducing more traffic at the school, right? The very problem. This 5-minute safety delay meant those cars sat, all the pedestrians left. What do you imagine kids started to say to their parents? Why? Why did they say, I want to walk? I don't want to sit in the gym for 5 minutes at the end of the day. That's like infinity to a kid. At the end of the day, I might as well make me sit here for an hour and punish me, right? I want to walk out the door. So they said to their parents, pick me up at the parking lot at the far end of the park. Let me walk through the park, or let me walk home with the walking school bus. But under no circumstances, pick me up in front of the school. It was a brilliant policy. So when we get to P, policy change, that's when we actually create permanent behavior change. Because if we just do nice and walking school buses and all that other stuff, we're going to spend our life recruiting walking school bus leaders. We take into account all four users: the pedestrian, bicyclist, transit, and motor vehicles. That's what the Complete Streets campaign is at its heart. I see four things that communities, states, neighborhoods move through, four phases. Okay? Phase one is sort of the passage of some kind of a policy resolution or executive order. A mayor, a city council, a town board, a neighborhood association, a planning commission. But then beyond that, public works, engineering, transportation departments have to adopt it as policy. They have to say, here's how we're going to do that. But that's not enough. You have to actually go do some first steps and create some demonstration projects to show it's possible. And then, having done all that, it becomes institutionalized. It becomes part of the routine planning and practices of all departments in the city, the municipality, wherever you're working, the county. Everybody, including the staff, but also the consultants you hire, consider all four modes on every project. Then that means routine procedures. So I show you from my little hometown, that's a Walmart that got put in there. Often when we do a project, we do what's called a traffic impact analysis. TIA is the acronym. Count the number of cars that are going to be generated. How many car trips? That's great, but the problem is it doesn't take into account the other three modes. What we should always do as a matter of course now is a multimodal transportation analysis, all four modes. Count how many pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and motor vehicle trips. And then when we look at all that, we might say, sure, we have to put in a turning lane for the cars, or maybe a signal light, but we also should put in a transit shelter and a pathway from the transit shelter to the front door. We should put in a bike lane, or maybe some shared use arrows. We should create a sidewalk link. If we think about all four modes with an MMTA, then you get accommodation in all four. This is a procedural change that you could do tomorrow in Palau. You could say, any project that's being done, at very least, let's estimate the number of pedestrian, bicycle, and transit trips, not just car trips. But it's very poignant. When you go down to 69th at Queens Boulevard there and see this memorial to a bicyclist who was killed right at that intersection, that reminds you how real this need is, right? You know, but the good news is they're trying to convene that working group, the very working group we're talking about. This should be more than a Vision Zero group. It should not just be those safety measures. If it's all about enforcement and writing tickets, that won't be enough. The physical infrastructure's got to change. It's back to the stickiness problem. Enforcement alone, that curve will look like that, right? We know that with speed enforcement programs, for example. So let's get people out on walk audits. Let's create an inventory of complete streets. We're going to go start doing that right now. And the inventory could ask simple questions like, is there a sidewalk or not? Is it in good repair or not? Is there a shoulder? Is there a defined bicycle lane or a guideline? In other words, what's out there now? What could we do to make it better? And then recognize that we can start with the cheap stuff like paint. So this is in Hawaii. So to give you a sense, Judy, you know, sort of, this is just a neighborhood street in Hawaii, posted at 25 miles an hour. That looks like about a 40-mile-an-hour road for me, though. It's wide, it's straight, I can haul down there. If I were to paint lines, well, that makes it actually feel a little slower. And if I were to bring those lines in and define bike lanes and put a center line, now I can't just be out in the middle here. I know I've got to be over here. That slows me down even further. Pretty cheap date, right? It's paint, right? But now the design of the road reflects the sign. This sign means almost nothing if the road doesn't look like a 25-mile-an-hour road. I mean that quite sincerely. So let's think about that. High visibility crosswalks. They can be artistic. This is being done in some of the neighborhoods in Boston, and it's really cool. It's not real brick, by the way. It just looks like the real brick is a problem because it lifts up and it's a huge maintenance headache. This is a cheap way to give you some aesthetics in a pedestrian district, but simple ladder-style striping. You see it all around in New York City. How about reversible treatments? Things like these bollards and barriers, which could go away. If this turned out to be a total disaster to lose that lane, on Broadway, we're fairly near, I think, Times Square there. Or these, those are planters. Those are big planters and removable bollards. So they do that way so that people don't blow a gasket. Say, look, if this a year from now is a total disaster, we could take it away. Of course, what happens is they're wildly successful. People love being able to actually walk safely there, and we're doing more of it. But think about this as a treatment. Back to rural settings, Judy, for you. One of the simplest things is simply not leaving gravel, but creating actual shoulders, paved shoulders. Now, I mention this because when we get out to rural settings, and this is really relevant for when we worked in Hawaii, you know, on some of the more rural roads there, it would be relevant Palau. But here's a point. This is a geeky page, which if I sat with a traffic engineer, I could give him about 20 reasons from this page why shoulders are better that have nothing to do with bicyclists and pedestrians. In other words, if I'm just being a responsible traffic engineer, for maintenance purposes, for example, we know that by adding the curb, the shoulder, then the water runoff doesn't undermine the road and I don't have to repave as often. It gives me a recovery area where I can move vehicles. So if I have maintenance vehicles or I have to set up signs when I'm doing work on the road, I have a place to do that. So there are safety reasons. Vehicles can pull off of the road and be out of traffic and not go into the gravel. I can take evasive maneuvers. If a car were to become suddenly disabled, I can get around them. So there are all these reasons. I'm not going to belabor this. Just make the point that these are all reasons to add shoulders that have nothing to do with bicyclists and pedestrians. So Judy, when we go to Palau and say to them, we should at least be putting shoulders on the roads that people could walk on, they don't have to do it because people can walk there. They can do it for these other reasons. My point in showing you this is reminding you, we've got to speak to whatever of interest to the person we're talking to. So if it's an economic development officer, we show them that economic data. If it's a traffic safety or a traffic engineer, we show them lower your maintenance costs by investing in the shoulders now. But simple things like bicycle lanes, sharrows. This is called a sharrow or a shared use arrow. You're seeing them. You're seeing them around Queens. I saw a couple, in fact. So here was a street that I walked on yesterday, and I thought, man, that's a lot of, it's just undefined. And simply putting in the shared use arrows would tell me I could expect to see bikes, or even better, stripe a bike lane and put a bike decal there. And what did I see as I walked to my bed and breakfast last night? One of those, that's 59th up at Broadway. So they're doing it. So just so you don't think Mark is full of crap and coming up with stupid ideas that will never happen in Queens, there's one in Queens. And I'm telling you that because you guys, if you go to make the case and they push back on you, say, no, we're already doing it here. Don't tell me it can't happen here. Understand, by the way, there are maintenance costs associated with this. This has got to be repainted every year. So let's be realistic. Let's also say, good, what do we need to do to advocate to make sure the funding is there for the maintenance? Because this is important enough. If this saves lives, because now drivers expect to see bicyclists, they aren't surprised when there's a bicyclist there, and bicycles know they can ride on that road, then that's worth investing in. Parklets, we talked about these last night. The idea of creating a structure that comes right off at sidewalk level and replacing 1 or 2 parking spaces with a mini park. It's a great way to green up an otherwise heavily asphalted sort of environment. So there are no street trees, there's nothing out to break it up visually. These tend to act both as traffic calming and as pedestrian enclaves, right? They can be seating for a restaurant, they can just be random seating, a little park space. You could also create curb extensions here with bollards and put the bike parking in it. So here, I love that in Boulder, Colorado, here's the free bike parking right next where you can pay for your car parking. It's a clear message there. Well, you can give us your money if you want, but if you rode your bike, you'd be paying $0. We also are seeing places replace neighborhood stop signs, which are often put in place to calm the traffic. So it's not that there's a lot of traffic on some of these quieter streets, it's just that the traffic goes too fast through the neighborhood, so we want to slow them down, and replace them with mini roundabouts, small circles, which means the cars don't have to stop and idle and toss their gases out into that neighborhood, right? We don't want them idling there. I want them to move through smoothly. Larger roundabouts are being used in formerly signalized intersections, and the only reason I show this photo is that's a giant truck with a trailer. You can build roundabouts that the biggest fire truck in your fleet can get through. Putting in medians, this is just down the street from us here. Here's a median island from a work done in Hawaii. Very nice design here because it's offset, meaning the pedestrian, as she crosses through the middle there, actually has to look toward the oncoming traffic. So that's why it's not straight through, why it's angled like that. And that increases the likelihood she's going to make eye contact with and or see the vehicle that's coming. And then lane realignments. That's really a hot topic now in engineering, reallocating the space. So this is a 4 to 3 lane reduction, 1 travel lane in each direction with a center turning lane. It helps eliminate a horrible collision that occurs here very commonly in 4 lanes. I try to make a left turn here. There are 2 lanes of oncoming traffic. Even if the first car yields to me, they see me and stop, the second one might not see me. I start to make the turn, boom. Horrible for pedestrians too. It's called a multiple threat, right? First car yields, I step out, second one I don't see. So reducing that to 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane means I move the turning vehicles out of the travel lane so I don't impede this traffic. And I can then, where there's no turning movements, put in those center islands, and I get space for bike lanes. So this is in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. The local businesses blew a gasket. A couple of local guys said there's no way 3 lanes can carry as much traffic as 4. It was a big to-do in the newspaper. To their credit, they had the guts. They made the change. They've now reduced collisions, and the traffic moves just as smoothly, and it's vastly safer for bicyclists and pedestrians. But let me give you the wild ideas. This from New York. You've seen places like this, the city bike installation, the protected bike lanes set off from the roadway, taking away motor vehicle lanes. Here's Salt Lake City, Utah, where they actually use things like shipping containers to create a stage and a beer garden in the middle of an oversized road. So they're reclaiming the asphalt, not unlike what they did in Times Square and other places here. And they've made this a neighborhood center. This is a community garden in little kids' plastic pools. You know those little pools, the little wading pools? That's a series of community gardens. So the community garden space, a performance space, and a beer garden right out in the middle of the road. Wouldn't it be cool to take half of Queens Boulevard and just do that, man, and change the character? This has to become routine. Your long-term goal, do the samples, have good successes in Queens that say, see, this can happen, and then you say, and then we expect you to do this all the time. This has to become the new normal. Judy, for you, same deal. Lay down a couple of early successes, show that the world doesn't come to an end, traffic can still move, and then say this has to be our standard design criteria on Palau going forward. This is just how we have to do this work. And that's what they've done in Nashville, Tennessee, as they do their metropolitan planning organization. That's the regional planning entity that dictates where their federal transportation dollars get spent, what projects get it. They have an application project. You apply a process. You apply for the money, and then the ones that score highest in the application get the dough. Well, here's the interesting thing. Their scoring system now includes pedestrian, bicycle, and transit travel. And if you don't do enough, your score will be too low, you won't end up getting money. In other words, the people who are getting funded now are the ones that get enough points in these 3 modes that they're the ones that get funded. So they're ending up with complete streets projects as a matter of course. I want to put a little scale on this, why I'm a raving lunatic about this. You may be aware we kill about 4,000 pedestrians each year in the United States. What's striking to me is 250 of them are in New York. That's a huge portion for one municipal metropolitan area of the annual pedestrian deaths in this country. About 40,000 die nationally in motor vehicle collisions, but as I told you before, closer to 400,000 die due to sedentary living and poor nutrition. Let's make sure we remember those orders of magnitude. We could talk about our dependence on foreign oil. We could talk about the fact that businesses are now wanting to locate in more livable, walkable communities where they are going to have high employee retention and lower health care costs. This is a bridge across the Susquehanna River in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, connecting downtown, the capital, to an island in the river called City Island Park. On that island, it's a big island. Their minor league baseball diamond is there, a zoo, a park. He's walking across the bridge. I say, can I take a picture? Oh, by the way, it used to carry cars. Now it's just bicycle and pedestrian bridge. I say, can I take a picture? You're walking on the bridge. He goes, yeah. I said, do you get a lot of exercise? What a great place to walk. There's a trail along the river. They've done traffic calming, so it's easy to walk downtown from this. I say, do you get a lot of exercise? He goes, no, not really. I say, well, where are you going? He goes, I park my car on the island because they only charge $1 a day at the baseball field. The games are at night, so it's $1 all day. Where are you coming from? Downtown by the state capitol, but I don't park there because they charge like $8 or $9 a day. And they've done this thing called traffic calming to slow the traffic, so it's just easier to walk back and forth. So how long does it take you? He says, about maybe 15 minutes each way. And how often do you do that? And I'm thinking he's going to say like once a year I have to go get a license renewed. He says, every day I work down there. Now I had said, do you get any exercise because of the bridge? And what did he say? No. How much physical activity is he getting? 30 minutes, right? 15 minutes each way. He's meeting the recommendation. He doesn't think it's exercise. He thinks he's saving $8 a day on parking, which is fine with me. I also don't care whether he loses any weight because I know physical activity is an independent risk factor. And if he gets that walk every day, he's going to live a longer, healthier life. He's going to make fewer healthcare claims. He's going to be present at work more often and more productive. All of those wins for society. By the way, I'm a raving lunatic, frankly, not for that guy, not for any of you. It's for them. Those are my kids, who are now 16 and 18, but I have frozen in time at 3 and 5 because it reminds me they're part of the first generation that's going to end up with statistically shorter life expectancies than their parents. That's what we know about the generation we're raising right now. And by the way, we know that low income and minority kids are at much greater risk, right? They're the ones that are much more likely to end up early onset of those chronic diseases that lead us to our demise in modern American society, right? We don't die of infectious diseases. We die of the diseases of sedentary living, poor nutrition, tobacco use. I think that's a completely unreasonable fate to put on the next generation. So that's why we have to do this stuff. That's why we have to be tough when people push back and say, no, we're not asking, we're telling. This is what a community should be designed like. Take a breath.